I'm the faculty director of the Pozen Family Center for Human Rights, and I want to welcome you to Human Rights at the Crossroads, a symposium to mark the 25th anniversary of the founding of the center. In 1997, an intrepid group of interdisciplinary faculty at the university decided to establish a new human rights center here at Chicago. And in typical fashion, they imagined a program not like human rights programs that were beginning to emerge at other universities around the country and around the world. They didn't want a program that necessarily was centered in a law school, and that's where most programs in this period of time were. Now, it wasn't like these founders were allergic to law, and actually law and the law school have been very important partners for the Pozen Center over the course of its 25 years, but they wanted to look in more capacious interdisciplinary directions, and they wanted to involve humanists and social scientists. They wanted to involve bench scientists in biology, physics, or chemistry, and they wanted to involve people in medicine and also the law. They were also keen to develop a program that combined an emphasis on both human rights theory and human rights practice, and that thought about the entanglements of those and how, as one thought together between theory and practice, one might think about the human rights space in different sorts of ways. 25 years later, we have with us in the room tonight representatives of the many ways in which that founding vision has been realized. We have alums here tonight of our human rights program, or human rights internship program, that has sent more than 500 college and graduate students out in the world to do human rights work in fully funded summer internships. We have alums with us tonight who took the growing number of Pozen Center-sponsored human rights courses in a variety of fields. Some of these students became human rights minors. Others studied abroad with the center's human rights program in Vienna. Others fulfilled their college core civilization requirement by doing human rights in world civilization. We've got some current college students with us tonight as well, some of whom are in the first cohort of the center's just established human rights major. So for the first time this year, the University of Chicago has a major in human rights, and we're delighted that so many students have already come to see this as a program that they might like to be a part of. We also have some students with us tonight who are a part of a new mixed enrollment course that started this quarter. The vision was to do it quite a bit earlier, but the pandemic got a bit in the way. But this quarter, college students and incarcerated men at Stateville Prison. This is a part of the human rights laboratory that the Pozen Center is involved in and its project on mass incarceration. We've also got faculty. We've got current and former postdocs. We've got doctoral students. We've got BA thesis writers in the room for whom the Pozen Center offered both support and sometimes money for their innovative and field-transforming research. And we have some of the program's founders in the room too, as well as some of the many donors who have generously helped to take the vision of the founders forward. So it's marvelous to have all of you with us tonight. Our aim is not just to celebrate, but also to look forward. And so this symposium gathers together a group of leading human rights scholars and practitioners who will take stock of the state of the Human Rights Project today and suggest what they see as some of its future trajectories. I'll introduce them in just a moment, but before I do so, I want to bring to the stage two people who are kindly offering some remarks to open this anniversary event. The first is President Paul Alvasados. And I just want to say, as Paul comes up, that many of you know that Paul is a college BA. It's 81, Paul, is that right? So I just want to point out, 81, 97. So Paul he got here too early, in a sense, to either be a human rights intern or to be a minor or major. But we're delighted you're with us here today, and I invite you to come up.
Thank you, Mark. And indeed, the secret is out that I missed my chance by a good many years. But actually, I really am honored, and I want to just speak to how powerful it is that we're marking this anniversary, and to celebrate with you the Pozen Family Center for Human Rights, and to recognize the importance of such an anniversary. As you said, it's the 25th year for this program, and I think it's to me, it speaks very deeply to the importance of having a program like this inside the University of Chicago, and also the enormous importance of the University of Chicago engaging with the world with deep scholarship, but also a commitment to practice. Indeed, it's the 25th anniversary, and this program, as you said, Mark, critically explores the theory and practice of global human rights, and it has a set of innovative, very innovative interdisciplinary teaching and research, emphasizing, as you said, the connections across all the different disciplines at the university. In fact, when we were chatting a moment ago, we talked about how maybe even some of the data scientists who are now emerging at the university can play a role in helping us get a picture of some of the things that are going on in the world today. So as the university's horizons expand, so will the connections to this center grow. The vision was extraordinary from the outset, and it has been rooted in cross-disciplinary inquiry, and it has challenged our community and all the scholars who work with us around the world to surface the hardest issues around human rights, knowledge creation, and to think hard about practice across the university's schools and divisions. It's an inspiring mission, and the good work of this center did not go unnoticed. I'd like to acknowledge the generous gift from alumnus Richard Pozen, from Ann Pozen and their family. In 2014, the program was able to expand and deepen its reach within and without the boundaries of the university. And in recognition of their philanthropy, the university is honored to be able to rename it as the Pozen Family Center for Human Rights. It's a wonderful gift enabling this important work. It's an expansive and field-shaping kind of center, and I was so excited to hear what you said about how there's now, as of this year, an undergraduate major, and that the numbers are already larger than what you had expected, because that really speaks to how much our students really want to be a part of this kind of scholarship. They want their knowledge, their ability to learn from a core of liberal arts, and then to expand that into having a positive impact in the world, and to thinking about the hardest problems. The fact that our students want to be a part of this is just a wonderful, wonderful thing. There are, of course, also study abroad, and there's a core sequence. There's a fully funded set of summer human rights internships. And you were telling me the struggles of getting internships in the early days. And so the fact that more than 500 college students have been a part of those internships, it's a wonderful thing. It's home to a human rights laboratory focused on mass incarceration. And the center also hosts an annual Pozen Visiting Professorship. There's research support for graduate students and faculty, and a robust annual calendar of events, conferences, and workshops, including this one. So in short, the center in its 25 years has done so much on such an important topic for the world. And I'm sure that the next 25 years, the center will grow and evolve, and that its impact will become even greater. I'm really excited that you have a group of people here to think about the different challenges of human rights today. They probably look very, very different than in 1997, as the arc of history has evolved in ways, some very difficult. But I think the center will be placed for really as long as the university will be here, to be able to help think harder about these problems, and to bring our faculty and students into engagement on one of the most important topics in the world. So congratulations and thank you.
We have one more person who would like to help us get this started, and that's Dean John Boyer. And I know it's going to seem as if I'm kind of quantitatively oriented tonight, but Dean Boyer, this is his 6th term as dean. So that means that John was certainly easily present at creation for 1997 and the beginning of the Pozen Center. John has been an incredible supporter of the center all the way along. He and the college both, particularly as we've been trying to draw forward these curricular initiatives around expanding internships, the mass incarceration program through the Human Rights Lab, and now the Human Rights major. John, could I invite you to come up and say a few words?
Thank you, Mark. I just want to say a couple of things. This program is successful because of the extraordinary leadership of a number of colleagues along the way, and I want to come back to that. But I think it was also a lucky program because it began at a time in the history of the university which was in which we were engaged in a number of tumultuous debates. They were called the core wars, and there were alumni websites denouncing what we were doing. Jeff Stone is here; he was being denounced along with me, and it's not a bad thing to be denounced as long as you live to fight another day. And one of the objectives of all of our efforts at that point was to try to open up the curriculum and make things more flexible and also give students more opportunities to follow their own inclinations. That's called freedom, by the way, or liberty or something of that sort. And the skeptics at the time were asking, well, if we allow the students more electives as opposed to requiring everything, what will they do? Will they misuse? Will they be able to make good choices? And of course, it was just very a good thing that there were a number of these new interdisciplinary programs, gender studies, race studies, human rights, law letters that emerged really at the end of the 1990s that actually showed that one could actually provide a set of new opportunities, exciting new intellectual opportunities that were both scholarly, very defensible, and indeed very attractive, but also that students would actually want to do and would choose to do using their own volition and their own liberty and their own freedom. And I think the program came at exactly the right time in the history of the university and the history of the college. There was a kind of an opening or a window or a door opened, and they were able to walk through it. But they were able to walk through it because, as Mark and as Paul have alluded to, it was a program that had a rather capacious sense of both of what it was, what it wanted to be, and the assets that it had. It drew upon not only our distinguished college and the law school, but also faculty from across the divisions and across the professional schools. And I think this amalgamation of talent and interest, at times it seemed a little bit chaotic and unplanned, but good things often come out of moments of chaos and unplannedness. And I think the success of the program was really very much owing to its willingness to take the risks of being creative at a time when there were opportunities to be creative, in which students really appreciated that kind of creativity. The structures that followed, because all good things eventually have to be structured, so there was a certificate eventually, and then a minor, and then a core curriculum, and now a major. These are all kind of elements of the maturing of this original spurt of creativity and kind of energy. And I think the program now is really quite impressive in its balance between structure and I would say kind of independent opportunity for students. And I think that's a very good thing. The other thing I wanted to mention is there's been an allusion to these internship programs. These have had a profound impact on the lives of our students in the college, and I probably in the divisions and professional schools as well in the last 30 years. I had the opportunity to read some of the reports of the students who went on these internships had to write reports, and they were not like, write a paragraph, send us a postcard, and tell us what you did or didn't do, or that you actually went at all. But these were very detailed and very moving reports, very autobiographical. And these reports came from 2004. We have a whole shelf of them, and they were really quite amazing. And I do want to pay tribute to Susan Jess, who was led the effort to create these internships back in those days. It was a very important thing that Susan did. And the reports they're moving not only because of what the students did going to India to work with youth training, or going to Africa to work in housing rights and issues of displacement of people, or to Israel to work with migrant labor and sex trafficking. The topics were capacious and really unpredictably wonderful. But also the reports revealed a kind of introspection and a kind of personal development that the person who went on this, the persons who went on these internships on June 1st and the persons who came back on September 1st were in some ways the same person, but they were different persons. And the transformation that happened, whether ending up in a rural town in India, in which the first thing that you're told is don't use the word human rights, because you can get into a lot of trouble, and you can get me into a lot of trouble, and maybe nobody's going to be back again if we talk about human rights. But what are you supposed to do? You're there to do your internship. Or whether you're going to talk about housing rights, and you find the enormous challenges and human costs of displacement and people being thrown out of housing. And then you're standing as a young college student wanting to do something, and you got a real sense of the frailty of your mission and how big the problem is, and how small you are, and how small the efforts are. But one needs to stay with it and not become depressed or dispirited, and how one gets up again and does something, and one is inspired by the people who are there full time doing this every day, for year in, year out. I think these were great modeling experiences for our students, and I think we should not underestimate the power of these experiences. And if you multiply them by 500 for this program, and then many of the other internships that we've had in many of these other programs, this has really been a powerful, almost like a cultural revolution in the college, and it's been done in a bottom-up way by colleagues like Susan and Mark and all the faculty in this room, mobilizing resources and mobilizing opportunities for our very talented students to be able to undertake these programs. Finally, I just want to pay tribute to Mark. Mark has been he's in his third term as faculty director. There are maybe a few more terms. It's only the third. So, but his program building skills and his ability to think through complex and multi-level agendas and to kind of meld together faculty research and doctoral research and education for master's students and undergraduate students. This is not an easy puzzle to put together on any given day, and he's done an extraordinary job working in this position since 2014. And so I want to thank him on behalf of the university for his enlightened leadership and his willingness to both think big, but also work small in all the ways that working small helps to confirm the success of working big. Finally, a word of tribute to Richard and Ann Pozen. These are extraordinary friends and alums who have a extraordinary dedication to the mission of the university in general, and also particularly to the college. They are philanthropic supporters of the best kind. They're willing to give a lot of resources and then stand back and let the faculty use the resources without trying to tell the faculty what to do. That's not a rare thing, but it's an important thing. And I think the success of their program, success of your program, you who are involved in the program, is owing to this generosity of not only of philanthropy, but generosity of spirit, this willingness to trust the faculty and to believe in the faculty, and to believe in the students perhaps even more than the faculty, which has resulted in a very fulsome and a rich and rather remarkable program in which I think we can all be very proud. So congratulations to all of you. I hope that you celebrate your birthday properly and that there's another great one in another 25 years. Thanks very much.
We have one more welcome, and then the symposium begins. There are a number of people who are watching on live stream today for the symposium, and two of them are Richard and Ann Pozen, who were unable to travel to Chicago for the meeting. But they put together a really, really nice video for us that we wanted to show. It's short, but it really, I think, beautifully frames what it is the program has been about for the last 25 years. So if that can magically appear on the screen right now, that would be great.
When I was an undergraduate at the college in the 60s, there were a lot of human rights issues going around in the United States as well as internationally. But we had no forum at the university. There was no curriculum. There were no courses. There was no center to address issues of human rights and for people to get together. And Anne and I have been strong supporters of human rights issues for many years. So we saw this as an opportunity to get involved.
We supported a few internships in the beginning, and then we were invited to a presentation that the interns gave about their projects. And we were really very much impressed with the commitment and maturity of these students.
We continued really to appreciate what was being done. And then fortunately, we were in a position where we were able to actually help endow the center. And that was a really, really significant moment for us. We really appreciate the leadership. We spent some time with Susan Zesch, and we said this is something we really wanted to support. Michael Geyer really took over running that program for a number of years. And then for many years now, Mark Bradley has really been key to the leadership in this program. And Kathleen Cavanaugh was brought on board, and Alice Kim, who's really running the lab program. And this is another extremely unique program. We're very happy for this 25th anniversary. This is a real occasion. We're very sorry we couldn't be there in person. It would be nice to see everybody again, and I'm sure that we're going to continue our Chicago visits as time goes on. But I want to thank everybody who's been involved with the program, from the development people to the faculty to the leadership, and to John Boyer and the university who've supported this program all through these years. And this is much, much more than we ever expected 20 plus years ago when we started to involve ourselves. And we can't think of a better way to have been involved than the way we are at the university.
Of course, this has always been about the students, and we are so grateful and impressed with the quality of the students who have committed themselves to human rights at the University of Chicago. They're really what has kept us going and kept us supporting the program. We definitely want to thank the students.
We wanted to really support the students, and we think we have.
Thank you, Richard and Ann. I assume you can hear us someplace in Bethesda in your living room at the moment. And now to tonight's main event. And if we can ask the various panelists to move onto the stage. We're putting, 12 plus people on stage for this symposium, so there's a little bit of stagecraft that needs to go on with that. We've invited this distinguished group of human rights scholars and practitioners to help us think about what the project of human rights looks like today and where it may be going in the future. This is the way, given that we have quite a full stage, we're going to proceed. We've placed our panelists in 3 clusters, although actually that's not totally evident from the way in which people are seated here. But we're going to do a set of 20-minute rounds. So 20 minutes with the first cluster, 20 with the second, 20 with the third, and then we're going to move to a kind of committee of the whole and some Q&A with the audience as well. Now, we have a lot of distinguished people on this dais, and if I started doing the normal University of Chicago introductions, we'd be here, for another hour of preparatory remarks. So what I want to do is just let you know who they are and encourage you in your programs to take a deep dive into the distinguished biographies and work that all of these scholars have done. In our first cluster of people, we have Asli Bali. who works in international human rights law. She is at the Yale Law School. We have Darren Byler, who is in anthropology and international studies at Simon Fraser University. We have Aiche Chabuchu in sociology at the London School of Economics. And we have Adam Getachew, who is a Pozen faculty board member and also an assistant professor of political science in the new department of race, diaspora, and indigeneity. The second cluster is Kamari Clark, who is in sociolegal and transnational studies at the University of Toronto. And we have Suketu Mehta, who is in journalism at NYU. And moderating that cluster is Jessica Darrow, also on our faculty board, and an associate instructor, or associate professor, excuse me, at the Crown School of Social Work. And finally, in cluster 3, we have Evan Lyons from Partners in Health. Evan has also been team teaching a really important course for the Center for a long time, Health and Human Rights, with Renslow Shear. So it's particularly nice in both ways to have you here, Evan. Juno Jill Richards from the English department at Yale University. Howard Chang from the history department at UC Davis. And finally, Sam Moyne, who is both in law and history at Yale University as well. And the moderator there, Johanna Ransmeyer, co-chair of the faculty board of the Pozen Center and an associate professor of history. Tom Ginsberg, who along with, Tom's right down there, with Joanna, is our other co-chair, will be coming up after these clusters are done, and he'll be leading the Q&A with the panelists and also with the audience. So Adam, can I hand things over to you?
Great. Is this on? I think so. Well, welcome everybody. So we have the pleasure of starting the conversation off with a discussion about human rights and accountability. And so Asla, I'll start with you and just ask you to think with us about a recent piece you wrote for the Quincy Institute, thinking through US policy on human rights accountability. So what are the limits of the US approach to international human rights protection, and what would be productive alternative paths you lay out?
So thanks so much for having me. It's a delight to be here. And in that piece, I wanted to engage with the ways in which the United States has been over-reliant on coercive scripts of accountability, both in terms of military coercion and in terms of the use of economic sanctions, which have had very deleterious and adverse human rights consequences. And so I wanted to think through what might be an alternative that would be a more restrained security approach to human rights that would emphasize greater forms of engagement and diplomatic practice. And here I had a number of thoughts. To begin with, I thought that the United States has tended to use power in ways that have proven disadvantageous, with an exaggerated conception of how much can be changed through the use of raw force, whether military or economic, and instead might profit from taking an approach that invests in, rather than disinvesting in, multilateralism, and specifically multilateral institutions that have expertise in international human rights, such as the United Nations, but others as well. Places where we have tended to withdraw, I think we should arguably, in fact, double down on commitment in order to have a more plausible face on the kinds of forms of human rights accountability we advance. I also think it's important to realize that the United States has much greater leverage with its allies than with its adversaries. And so using bilateral public and private diplomacy to persuade allies to improve their human rights records, and unfortunately we have many allies with atrocious human rights records, and so there's much room for improvement in this kind of bilateral pressure, would be very useful. And finally, there are areas that the United States has direct control itself on human rights outcomes. These include decisions that are made to provide or furnish military assistance to governments that are well known to be engaging in human rights violations against civilian populations. This should be, to the maximum extent possible, limited. There are also areas where the United States can directly, beneficially impact human rights outcomes by, for example, improving its own migration policies and refugee resettlement policies, and I think these should be prioritized. And finally, there are humanitarian initiatives that the United States underinvests in the areas of economic and social rights. And some of the most extreme deprivations of human rights in the international system today are in these domains that have been impacted by climate change, by food insecurity, by migration, which is oftentimes driven by the latter two, and by conflict. So just addressing our aid initiatives better to target improvements in human rights would be an incredible sort of benefit to achieving forms of human rights accountability that we have tended to underestimate and underinvest in.
Excellent. Okay, so one kind of standard post-colonial critique of international human rights law has always been that accountability is uneven. Weak states are subject to sanctions and interventions, while powerful states get away with it. So Darren and Aicha have both written about and thought through human rights violations by powerful states. Aicha in the case of the US war in Iraq, and Darren with the case of Uyghur dispossession and internal colonization in China. So what strategies and practices have activists, international institutions, and other actors used in these contexts to compel accountability? What openings seem most promising in these contexts? Darren can start us off.
Sure, thank you so much for the question. So I'll talk about three things: about the UN, about textiles, and about surveillance technology. So when it comes to the UN and its relationship to China and the United States, there's a lot of pressure, sort of sectarian pressure in the UN, especially when it comes to human rights discourse. Two sides, a kind of binary that's been built up. And this is the case when it comes to the Uyghurs as well. And the way that pressure has been built at the UN in relation to the Uyghurs has been through activists, through Uyghurs who were dispossessed, who were detained in some cases, and really speaking with a lot of courage to the UN human rights team about what they had experienced themselves, knowing that it could impact their families back in China. And then media pressure as well, that came through those same folks talking to media. And over time, over 2 years of working on this with the UN, eventually they published their report. It just came out a month or two ago, and they said in the report that what's happened to the Uyghurs may constitute crimes against humanity. So far, that's the extent of what's happened. It's now waiting for debate and has so far not moved forward because allies with China have sided with China and saying, we don't want to talk about this. We don't want to talk about this report. And so there's much more work that needs to be done, continued pressure to bring this to the UN. So that's the state of that. What's happened in relation to textiles is labor activists in the US and elsewhere thinking about forced labor laws that are already existent in our own legal system, and also labor rights in general, and how we should be thinking about textile manufacturing that's coming out of China, coming out of the Uyghur region, which is a source of around 20% of the world's supply, and how it builds fast fashion for all of us to buy. And so thinking about whether or not we want to be complicit in that and placing pressure on organizations like the Better Cotton Initiative, who say that they're going to support supply chain sort of transparency, has motivated companies to begin to relocate their supply chain and eventually ended up in the Prevention of Uyghur Forced Labor Act that was enacted and is now in law in the US. And that has had major implications. Hundreds of millions of dollars are at stake here for these companies using forced labor connected to the camp system. Probably the biggest success. When it comes to technology, though, we've had less success. Instead of what's happened is an acceleration of surveillance to keep up with the China threat, really. So the narrative around that, I think, is one that needs to be reversed and think about what we need to do to safeguard ourselves from police technology, from surveillance, how to de-accelerate that kind of tech development.
Great. Aicha?
Yes. The post-colonial critique of human rights has indeed highlighted the disjunction between the violence with which accountability is sought when it comes to weaker states, but the total lack of accountability when it comes to powerful states, the United States of America. So activists in response, I would like to give one example of the World Tribunal on Iraq, when the United States, United Kingdom, and their allies were planning to invade Iraq in 2003, the largest protest in human history took place a month before the invasion and occupation of Iraq began. That was February 15, 2003. And thousands of organizations and activists around the world who were opposed to the invasion of Iraq in the name of human rights and democracy, in addition to preventing a terror attack, alleged terror attack from Iraq, came together and constituted their own mechanism of accountability to hold the US, UK, and their allies accountable for what they knew were going to be war crimes, were going to be committed in Iraq, they suspected. So these activists constituted a civil society tribunal, for example, in the tradition of the Russell Tribunal of 1967 that was constituted, again, to put the US on trial for war crimes committed in Vietnam. So I was one of the people involved in setting up this tribunal some 20 years ago. So was Aslı, in fact. The tribunal took place in 20 cities around the world, including Barcelona, Brussels, Copenhagen, Frankfurt, Genoa, Lisbon, London, Mumbai, New York, Rome, Seoul, Stockholm, and many cities in Japan. So when official institutions of international law fail to hold powerful states accountable, a traditional, now I think we can call it traditional, way of establishing accountability has been through people's tribunals or civil society tribunals. I think these efforts are just as important as official mechanisms of accountability to hold the powerful states who constantly exceptionalize themselves and hold themselves above international law.
Great. Well, it's a pleasure to hear all of these ideas, and also you've been remarkably disciplined about time. So I want to ask one last question, and maybe you can take a minute extra here. So let me ask you to, each of you, reflect on what you think the most important questions to pursue or novel approaches to consider are when thinking about the perspective of human rights accountability. And this can be drawing on some of the work you've done or what you hope to kind of think of, what you think of are new frontiers or new sites of thinking about human rights accountability. And we can just go down the line.
Okay, great. So I will maybe pick up exactly where Ayça left off, because the point she made is that in the absence of international fora to hold powerful states to account, one possibility is civil society accountability. And as she noted, the opening session for thinking through accountability for the US and UK took place in places like New York and London. Mm-hmm. And that was because the idea was that we should bring human rights accountability home, and domestic audiences are in a position to hold their own governments to account in circumstances where the international system is unable to do so. More broadly, the idea of bringing human rights home, particularly in the global north, I think has enormous salience today. There are a troubling number of human rights areas in which some of the most pervasive abuses take place in the global north. Just to name some, racial justice protests that we've seen across the last 2 years, the problem of failure to respect migrant rights and to protect migrants and displaced persons at the borders of the global north, thinking through challenges of labor rights that were raised by some of the points that were just made by Darren earlier on the textile movement, thinking through climate change and its disruptive consequences for populations living in the global north that are marginalized and that are in minority communities, and thinking just more generally about the ways in which health inequities in the aftermath of a global pandemic have really been put in stark relief in the global north. So these are all areas in which it's possible to imagine human rights accountability strategies that focus on how can we improve human rights for the large proportions of populations that face very significant deprivations in the global north in ways that are within our control without even thinking in international terms. We're thinking globally, of course, these are global issues, but we can hold our own governments to account in ways that they simply escape accountability as a consequence of the kinds of exceptionalism that Ayça highlighted. I would also say, returning to a theme that I raised at the end of my earlier remarks, economic and social rights are woefully neglected when we talk about global human rights. They are at least co-equal, and in a world of pandemics, climate change, migration crises, global food supply shortages, energy crises, they are actually far more salient for many populations of the world over than stories about civil and political rights that we tend to think about in the kind of classic mode of the lone person, individual standing up to an authoritarian state. That is not the mode in which most people experience human rights deprivations, and placing a new emphasis on economic and social rights, again, particularly in the parts of the global north where these rights have been most neglected, most sidelined, most subordinated, would be, I think, a huge advance, and would really behoove those of us who are thinking and working about human rights in the global north, and particularly in the capital of global empire here in the United States, to really make the top of our agenda. So rethinking, for example, university human rights programs around economic and social rights questions, rather than imagining them as primarily, for example, accountability through prosecutorial strategies or international criminal law, focusing instead on the areas where I would say the breaches are most grave in the international system today.
That's a great question. So one of the things I'm hearing from my co-panelists is that we need to ask people what they want, the people that are most affected by human rights abuse. And we need to also think about grassroots strategies, organizing at the grassroots. And so people's tribunals are an important way of staging, creating space for people to testify, to speak to what's happened to them, and creating a record, a documentation of what's happened as maybe a first step, but maybe as a way of supplementing what's happening elsewhere. And the Uyghur Tribunal, which happened in London over the last 2 years, has done that. It's created this archive of people speaking truth to power. Important work. Another thing I think to think about is how to stage sort of truth and reconciliation type events. And I just a moment ago spoke about how technology can be used in a really harmful way. It is being used in a really harmful way to surveil Uyghurs, surveil people in China in general, to criminalize social behavior, essentially. But technology also offers some spaces of in between, outside of the gaze. And one moment around 2 years ago happened on this app called Clubhouse, which is an audio-based app. And for a moment in China, it was freely available without sort of censorship, as long as you had an iPhone. And so people across China got onto this audio space that was led by Uyghurs in diaspora, talking about, are there concentration camps in Northwest China? And the overwhelming response from the Han people, Chinese people in China, was that yes, in fact, there are, and we've seen them. We've experienced family members being impacted by them, and it was just this really emotional experience that went on for almost 24 hours straight, of people sort of expressing things that they couldn't speak out loud otherwise on this public-private platform. And so for Uyghurs around the world, it was this really important moment of recognition that what's happened to them is true. And so I think grassroots sort of organizing in that way is really important for the affected communities.
Yes, I think what the World Tribunal on Iraq is jury of conscience in its final session in Istanbul 20 years ago, in the declaration of the jury, which was the spokesperson of which was the novelist Arundhati Roy, the declaration found, and I quote, well, the declaration questioned, I quote, the import and significance of international law, human rights covenants, and the ability of international institutions such as the United Nations to address the crisis in Iraq with any degree of authority or dignity. I think we're still living in this moment when, to the extent that international organizations and international institutions of international law and human rights are unable or unwilling to hold the most powerful states accountable, we need to think beyond, I think, as far as the future of human rights is concerned, beyond these institutions and or critique them at their roots and ask, well, can they deliver justice? Can they be instruments of global justice at all? I think that's going to be the challenge for human rights thinking in the 21st century.
Great, thank you. Okay, I'll pass it over to Jessica now for the second act of this conversation.
Thanks, Adon. Thanks, everybody, for being here. In preparing for tonight, I had the unbelievable opportunity to speak to my colleagues, the panelists here, about some of their work and try to find the common threads across the issues that they deal with and think about and write about. And some of those central themes that these two panelists have been grappling with in one way or another, and in some ways, or in some cases more overtly than others, are issues related to human rights violations and protections at and across borders, or thinking about land and space. So we're not necessarily thinking about migration, although that is one of the issues we'll touch on, but also really about land and about space. We're also thinking a little bit about the hegemony of whiteness and the construction of the racialized migrant. And again, I say in some cases more overtly than others. So I'm going to begin by asking you, Kumari, can you help us understand the role of human rights tech? And we've heard a little bit about some ways of thinking about technology, but I think you do this in a very different way in relation to violence, and how you connect the use of these instruments to the colonial history of border and property violence in the global South, and in particular thinking about the research that you're doing in Mexico and Nigeria.
Great. Thank you, Jessica. And really wonderful to be here and to be on a panel with people with whom work I so admire. So my colleagues have already talked to some extent about some forms of grassroots mobilization and also the role of technologies here. And some of the work that I've been doing over the last 3 years has been connected to early warning, early response signals. And some of you may already be quite familiar. It often is heralded as the new realm of human rights for new possibilities, especially in contexts where people cannot enter countries that are deemed sovereign, like in Syria and other places where it's difficult to garner evidence or to collect evidence in order to hold that evidence for future prosecution. And some of the work that I've been doing then with a number of grassroots organizations, in particular, I'll talk about Nigeria. This early warning, early response work uses satellite imagery, downloading satellite imagery. Often the algorithm triggers warnings when there are burnings. And in the context of northern Nigeria, what has happened as a result of global warming is that increasing herders from the Nigerian north are moving southward, and some of the migration southward is leading to cattle trampling on farmers' lands and sometimes destroying those lands. And when that destruction isn't resolved, and when it leads to the destruction of possible harvest that may be available, what sometimes breaks out is, of course, violence and vigilante protections, as well as responses that are reprisal responses that have to do with responding to an attack, which was a response to an attack, which was a response to an attack. And we see, and some of that involves the kidnapping, abductions, and cattle rustling. Now, many of us, and maybe even some of you who are interested in thinking about using these technologies to address such challenges, often consider technology as the next frontier. Sometimes drone technologies can serve a role in locating the missing and the abducted. Sometimes it's cellular uploads on platforms where people send alerts, and those alerts are meant to instruct people that there has been an attack, there's been an abduction, there's been a burning. And one of the challenges, though, with these technologies that we've seen in some of the work, and I'm just talking about Nigeria in this case, is that often the algorithm is written to detect burnings of property. So those who are propertied and those who are sedentary or nomadic or live in other conditions for whom there are no objects to be seen through the satellite, then are occluded from sight. And so here you see a relationship between human rights interventions that identify precisely the properties and the land that is assaulted, but what it occludes are 100 years of displacement of other people, including nomads and others. And one of the challenges with these technologies is that we zoom in and we upload those things that are visible, that are tangible, that are seeable in the name of human rights, but we don't necessarily have the optics and the mechanics for thinking about those things that aren't visible in the same way. So 100 years of displacement, the kinds of settlements that erased access to land routes and to movement routes for nomadic folks, the Fulani herdsmen, for example. And so this kind of early warning, early response that is heralded as revolutionary and that it in fact is seen as the next frontier for human rights work, it too has its challenges. So even as we may want to use these tools, they do really require other ways of thinking about how we can mobilize that doesn't occlude from sight the kind of historical temporalities of displacement, but that actually allows us to think complexly about their interrelationship.
Thanks, Kumari. As you're answering that question, I'm thinking about, in relation to Sukitu's work, I'm thinking about other themes that I didn't name, but really moving beyond the binary, right? Of this tech is good or bad, sort of this binary. And then thinking about land and who's included or excluded in the surveillance. And in that way, I see real parallels to your work. So turning to you, Sukitu, I'd like you to bring us squarely into what you call the global war of storytelling. And you urge us to move away from such dichotomies. So I wonder if you can share your narrative viewpoint and talk about how storytelling frames our understandings of who crosses a border and the right to movement, and then also the law of exclusion.
Okay. Thank you. It's really a great pleasure for me to be here, particularly since both of my sons recently graduated from the college, so I'm thrilled to be back here. I am a writer, a journalist, a storyteller, and it occurs to me that this kind of global war of storytelling happening in the area of migration, climate change, human rights. What is a populist? A person like Modi in India or Trump in the US or Putin in Russia. A populist is a gifted storyteller, someone who can tell a false story well. And the only way he can be fought is by telling a true story better. So what does it mean to tell true stories and to tell them better? Well, the populist conception of truth is essentially binary. As George Bush said, you are either with us or you are against us. And their story is very simple. It's got this direct, vigorous, simple appeal. Modi says, India is a Hindu country, and everyone else lives in India by Hindu sufferance. The story spread here by many people on the right is that America is a white Christian nation. For Putin, Ukraine can't exist because Ukraine is part of Greater Russia. It's not true, but it's got this direct, simple appeal. And too often, we people who know it's not true, we try to fight these stories by either just denying it outright and just saying, well, that's not true, and this is what's true, or not telling it well enough. We rely on numbers, on studies, on gatherings in wonderful universities like this, and we come up with policy papers. The prophets of all religions spoke in stories, in parables. There's no section of the Bible which says, In a recent poll, 87% of the people in Palestine said you should be nice to your neighbor so that your neighbor can be nice to you. The Prophet spoke in stories, in poems. And that's why we're still reading them. So how can we fight the populists? You know, a lot of Western philosophy rests, epistemology rests on the Aristotelian law of the excluded middle. Something is either true or false. The Jain system of logic from the Jain religion in India has a system of logic in which something can be true, false, both, neither. There's no fewer than 7 possible states of being. And you know what it's called, the system of logic? Shyadvada, the science of maybiness. And you know, as a novelist, as a writer, it's what fiction does. It's about maybiness. It's about moral complexity. And it is engaging. Dostoevsky made moral complexity engaging. So this is how we respond to the populists, whether it's about human rights, the right of a human being to live in peace, unmolested by the state, or migration, the right of a human body to move through the earth, which we have taken for granted throughout our history as a species. We do it by admitting of moral complexity and by celebrating that moral complexity and by telling a true story better.
Beautifully said. Thank you. As we were talking earlier about how we might close, I was sort of bringing my bias to this to say, we can all sit up here and talk as academics and write papers to each other, but as the Pozen said, we're also here for the students, and I would think primarily so as a university. And so I was sharing with Kumari, the internship program has changed the lives of so many people, right? You heard this, over 500 people who went through this program, thanks to Susan Zesch and those that followed and directed the program, to do unbelievable work around the world. It probably changed the lives of many. So I really want to direct these questions, this last response to questions, to the students, and think about who the activists are amongst you and what you want to go do. So I'm asking the panelists to close us out with a comment, to think about the most important questions that we should pursue in thinking about the protection to human rights, either at the border or in relation to boundary making, to inclusion, exclusion, to moving past these binaries. What charge do you have for these students to think about?
Great. I almost feel like I need to tell a story in answering that. But I won't this moment, but I promise I'll work on it. There are 2 optics or trajectories that I think are worth considering. The first has to do with technology and the need to think innovatively about these technologies that we are using, the apps, the deployment of drones for human rights work, the writing of algorithms, the use of AI in ways that actually can deepen the possibilities for thinking, for how we see, and that don't simply occlude from sight various ways of seeing. And so one arena is really to think vigorously about the technologies, how we use them, why we use them, what the limits of those technologies are, and what the limits of AI might be, and how is the algorithm actually written? What does it do for us? What do we see? What does it allow us to see? And what doesn't it allow us to see? And so that's one, really about the technology, which we herald as the future. And of course, there are limits to that and a tremendous amount of work that's needed. The second has to do with analytics. And this, I think, can be one of the most difficult, which is in a world in which accountability, criminal culpability, the language of the law is deployed as a way to think about solutions. The answers to the question, who is responsible, often is too simplistic. And in fact, the multiplicity of the 7, I think, can be conjured here in thinking about the nature of complexity. That our analytics, the ways that we understand culpability, have to be deepened temporally, they have to be deepened spatially. We need to understand not just individual culpability and the extent to which individuals are free actors who do bad things, but we also need to think about the nature of structural inequality, how it works, how it's invisibilized, and what that means, what the consequences of that occlusion are. And in doing that, in a lot of ways, it calls on us to really develop analytics that allow us to weigh next to each other individuals, societies, structures of inequality, histories of inequality, and to think analytically about the very questions that we ask about responsibility, whether it's criminal responsibility, social responsibility, and to continue to push ourselves to think far more complexly. And I think that my colleague's story about the 7, the realm of 7 possibilities is really a wonderful way to begin to try to make sense and to reckon with the nature of truth, that it's far more complex than we think. And so thank you for sharing that. And that's those 2 points really are what I want to offer for today.
Thanks, Kumari. Thank you, Kumari.
Thanks so much, Kumari. So I will tell a story, and it's a story about my grandfather. My grandfather was born in India when it was a British colony. Then he moved to Kenya when it was also a British colony. And then towards the end of his life, he went and settled in Britain. And he was sitting in a park in North London one day in the 90s, and this elderly British gent comes up to my grandfather and wags a finger at him and says, "Why are you here? Why don't you go back to your country?" And my grandfather, who was a businessman, said, "Why am I here? Because you came to my country and you took all my gold and my diamonds, so we have come to collect." He said, "We are the creditors. We are here because you were there." So, when he told me that story, I wrote a whole book about that. My last book is about immigration. And what I would say to you is, think about the narrative of immigration. Basically, when we discuss immigration in the rich countries, the discussion is from the point of view of the rich countries. Should we let in people? And if so, how many? And if so, how will they help us? Let's think about why these people are coming here in the first place. They're not coming here because they hate their homes or their languages or their families. They're coming here because we were there first. 2 countries, we were talking about borders, Britain and France, 2 countries made 40% of all the national borders in the world today. And so people are coming here because of colonialism, and then what replaced colonialism, which is corporate colonialism, war, and most of all, climate change. We Americans are 4% of the global population, but we put in 1/3 of the excess carbon in the atmosphere, and the EU another 1/4. So when 1/3 of Pakistan is underwater, where are they supposed to go? So I'd like you to think of immigration as a form of reparations.
Thank you, Sukhet. Thank you. Thank you. And now we'll turn to you, Johanna.
Wonderful, thank you. This brings us to our final cluster, in which we have history, literature, law, and medicine. So starting with all of these solutions, and now we have some big fields in the final cluster. And listening to everyone, it's just such a privilege to be here and be able to close out the panel with a question. And I'm thinking about the ways in which human rights work asks us to have a certain amount of integrity, but also self-scrutiny. And one of the threads that I see in the 4 final panelists is that they all urge us to scrutinize the project of doing human rights in different ways. So first I'm turning to Howard and Juno. Each of you have proposed new paradigms for investigating and navigating the issues of discrimination, of hate crimes, and identity-based persecution. And you've traced manifestations of these wrongs in really interesting ways and explanations for why why they happen in very interesting ways, as well as trying to come up with new mechanisms and modes for redress of those wrongs, and whether that's in literature, social movements, through art, or in the courtroom. For Howard Young, one of those paradigms is the paradigm of transtopia across the Chinese-speaking world, or the Sinophone. And for Juno Richards, one of the things that comes up is whether or not we should shift our mechanism for redress from an individual rights framework to a justice framework, which resonates a lot from what we've heard from the panel coming along. So could each of you say a little bit more about your own critical approaches, and then we'll move to the second half of our cluster.
Okay, sure. Yeah, thank you. It's an honor to be here, and I think in the last 10 to 15 years, I've been really playing with a paradox in my own work. So this relates to the way we position Taiwan in relation to gender and sexual minority rights movements. And so we've been talking about weak states, marginalized sovereignties, and the way that Taiwan sits in relation to the history of human rights in that regard is actually quite contradictory, right? So you may know that Taiwan actually sits at the forefront of lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer activism in the Asia Pacific. So for example, since 2003, it has been able to host the first annual Gay Pride Parade, and has been able to do that since, right? So Shanghai's Pride has been canceled during the pandemic, and the situation with Hong Kong is also looking very grim. And at the same time, in 2019, Taiwan also legalized same-sex union, which kind of surprised the international community. Right? The paradox that I've been working with comes from the fact that Taiwan also has not been really being able to maintain a nation-state status in the world, right? So, for example, we know that it continues to be excluded by very important organizations germane to our conversation today, such as the United Nations. It has also been excluded continuously by the World Health Organization. So what I'm saying here is that a lot of times we think about gender and sexual rights as something that pertains to the private realm, or something that's very individual based. But in fact, when you look at this history, there's no way we can ignore the importance of geopolitics. So when I developed this idea of transtopia in my last book, in some ways I'm trying to encourage us to think about ways of capturing queerness and gender transgression that are not always recognizable through Western categories, including the Western category of transgender, right, which is a loaded term and carries a lot of Western-centric baggage. We know for a while already that there are examples in cross-cultural history, whether we're talking about Hijra communities in South Asia, the warrior individuals, ritual specialists in Southeast Asia, Mushe communities in Mexico, or in the context of the modern West, Two-Spirit people in Native American societies. We know for a long time that the category of transgender may fail us. It might be too forced to impose it onto these their historical and political importance. So and I'm also I want to say I'm not like the first person, right, to call attention to the incoherence of Chineseness as it is applied to the Sinophone Pacific, or transness in the way it is applied to these different communities. But I do think that these theoretical rubrics serve a practical purpose, informs new visions for political action, and as such, even though there's not entirely new, but it definitely speaks, right, to the geopolitical realities that are unfolding before us.
Thank you, and thank you for having me here. My response also emerges from a critique of individualist rights frameworks, and I wanted to give you one history of this critique through Black feminist organizing, through the Sister Song Women of Color Reproductive Collective, which happened in the 1990s. And this movement emerged largely in contrast to the American birth control movement, which had focused mostly on what we think of today as the privacy doctrine, or the right to privacy as the guarantor for the right to contraception, the right to abortion. And so rather than focus on an individual right to privacy, which has been historically defined through the experience of white women, the Sister Song Collective organized around a project that they called reproductive justice that moved beyond contraceptive choices to consider racialized forces that inhibit these choices that we can make. So including beyond a singular right, an outsized vulnerability to police violence, premature death, state-sponsored medical oversight. So to start thinking of a wider field of justice, you could think of the right to bear a child or not, but also all the things you need to raise this child, the right to affordable housing, the right to clean water, the right to raise a child without prejudicial interference from children's welfare services. And I'm really interested in this wider framework because it begins from the perspective of people in society who are most affected by inequality and marginal identities. I think that I'm coming from a slightly different perspective than a number of people on this panel because I write about poems and novels and photographs and films. And I'm often telling my students that we're not necessarily looking for representations of rights violations as any kind of answer. Instead, it's about reimagining what a right might refer to or how to reimagine the relationship between an individual and a social good. And one kind of reimagining that I write about in my last book with a discussion of the Sister Song Reproductive Justice Collective is the form of a litany, or what does it mean to list names as a kind of memory work? It's not just about representing the dead or the lost, but the list itself becomes a kind of poetic form, right? A kind of form that can handle the kind of paradoxes that we've already talked about in terms of rights, or the ways that the freedoms of some can be premised on the unfreedoms of others.
Wonderful. Turning to Sam and Evan, and I'm going to put you together with my question, and then you can kind of hand it between the two of you. So Sam, your recent book brought you once again into conversation and critical conversation with global human rights organizations, debating and questioning approaches specifically to wartime conflict. As part of how we frame possibly shifting expectations both of what human rights, the concept, is doing in the world, but also what human rights organizations in practice are doing in the world. How do you think your ideas can be most useful to them in a sort of applied and sustained way? And then moving to the very applied world of global health and medicine, for Evan, if you could connect your global health work with projects in the wider world with what's happening here in Chicago, and think a little bit for us, and maybe this is a good place to be ending too, about how to be generative, proactive, and applicable to this vital project from the academic setting. You know, what is our position in relation to kind of the theory-practice nexus?
So it's been a privilege to be involved with the center over the last many years, and I just want to take my own second to congratulate those who have organized it, Michael and Susan and Mark and Kathleen and so many others. The role of an academic like me in relation to practitioners is honestly very hard to figure out, and it's been a difficult learning process. I think when many of us entered the field of human rights studies, as academics, we wanted to avoid a risk that seemed especially prominent in the 1990s and early 2000s, which was affirmation, kind of cheering from the sidelines, which even if practitioners liked it, wasn't really of that much value to them in thinking about their work. On the other hand, we faced our own risks, ignorance and abstraction and uselessness, which were often charges thrown in the face of those of us who were indeed abstract and often useless. Before he left, Dean Boyer said, "It's not a bad thing to be denounced," which I would have written down if I'd had a pen.
You'll remember.
Because I've had my fair share of denunciation. And actually, it's been an enormous learning process, largely because I've often been wrong. And getting over one's ignorance and uselessness is not an easy thing for an academic when there's an important project in the world. But I do think there's been, at least occasionally, the establishment of a productive relationship between academics and practitioners. And I can only speak from my own perspective, a little one, since I know all of us have established that relationship productively in some way. So I'll give two quick examples. A few years ago, I tried to say something about how mainstream human rights activism had not focused on distributive inequality. And I was called onto the carpet to come to Human Rights Watch. And I was riding up the elevator at the Empire State Building, low-key dreading it because I thought it was going to be another round of denunciation. But when I got there, I almost didn't have to talk because there was a great deal of tension within even this most mainstream and powerful human rights organization about its own need to shift agendas. And I was witness to a kind of civil war between generations at the organization. And so it turned out that those of us who, as academics, had prioritized civil liberties, begun to learn a lot about economic and social rights, and brought in structural inequality, belatedly ourselves were being mirrored within the practice community. And there was a lot of alliance to be made in that regard. More recently, I tried to say something about the risk of making war more humane when, as most human rights organizations do, you don't say anything about whether the wars are just or legal in the first place. And once again, my timing was bad or good, depending, because what I learned was that there was considerable unhappiness within human rights activism about the association between human rights and armed force that had gotten established across the 1990s and 2000s, especially in the Middle East. And so what happened was the forging of certain alliances that I myself didn't expect at the start between academics who were learning in our world along with practitioners doing the same. And so one great thing about this center has been that it's always kept that conversation open so that it's not just denunciation and misunderstanding, but learning together in a common history.
Awesome. Thanks everybody for being here and for hanging in. It's a privilege and a little fear to be the last. But kind of mirroring where Sam talked, as a human rights worker and practitioner, I've often struggled to know how to engage with the academic side of things. And in that spirit, and also celebrating the center, I want to talk about practice within these environments and learning, and especially the kind of experience learning that students have been able to do here and will be able to continue. As Mark mentioned, I do get a chance to teach here because I'm a practitioner and learned on the job and get to continue with some of that, and also work actively with Alice and some of the practice there, supporting education at Stateville Prison, et cetera. I want to tell a quick story that most people on the campus know, but I think there's the Pozen Center's role to kind of highlight. When I arrived here in 2011, there was not a trauma center at the University of Chicago. There had not been one since the 1980s. And there was really substantial neighborhood movement led by young people to request and demand a trauma center that was more accessible to this neighborhood. It takes time to get to Oak Lawn and Christ Hospital or to Northwestern. And as a new member of the faculty at the Biological Science Division on that west side of Ellis Avenue, I started asking around to see who was working on it, and I didn't find anybody. I found one guy who you probably also know. But as I settled into the university, I found the Human Rights Center. And that became a place to practice. That became a place to practice on the question of what's our role and responsibility to this question in our neighborhood as an institution, but also as a human rights question. And as my friend and mentor, Susan Zesch, used to say all the time, We have a flag, we have a soccer team, and we have a militarized force. Sounds like a state. Why don't we think about the role of this institution, which receives public funding through nonprofit status, through many mechanisms? Let's think about this as a human rights question. So we started doing teach-ins. There weren't a lot of folks on the medical side too happy to talk about it, so we invited in experts from across the city to sit here with our human rights students, with the Students for Health Equity, and gave a place and a venue to be in a dialogue that has, that continued and succeeded in meeting the demand of the community for better trauma care on this side of the city. And I think holding practice as the internship work, holding practice as collaboration between academics and others is important, but it was very valuable to have a practice center here that could see things from enough perspectives to be useful in that moment when, and I took a side quite clearly, but I think the university wasn't right about not building a trauma center, and we helped to kind of get there, right? And so I think that practice, that kind of practice is vital, and the support that comes from the learning environment and both teachers and students. The last little thing I wanted to say is about sort of the internship work and that way of learning. I'd met the Pozens some years ago, was thrilled to just hear them talk glowingly about the students and these experiences. I'm glad it's going to be even more part of the learning in the major, but also hope that there'll remain a spirit of really earning those partnerships, right? A guaranteed or an assigned internship could not take off, right? If there's not relationship, if the students aren't in a place to be in dialogue and actually find a place that matches. To me, that was the fun. When I matched students to potential internships, it was sorting out, is this going to work? Is it the right match? Did they need something the student might be helpful with? And failing a number of times and using that kind of iterative approach. So I wanted to offer that as one other last thought. Thanks.
Finally, I'm going to give the four of you a chance to kind of respond to either to each other or to the whole. We have the benefit of going last, so to the whole array here to think a little bit about trends you see in human rights. And I warned you about my trends question, but as I've been listening, I've also been thinking about backlashes. And maybe I'm partly triggered by Howard's comments about the one step forward, one step forward, two steps back, paradoxical situation of developments in Asia. But trends and worrying backlashes that you might like us to reflect on in closing, before Tom comes up and helps us with Q&A from everyone else.
Okay, I can go first. I think there has been less of a discussion, which I think there should be, in the Asia-Pacific region about indigenous rights, about how issues about race actually operate. It's kind of my secret hope that that will be one of the future trends that will emerge, at least in academic scholarship. Just to add one more thing, one more footnote to what I said earlier about Taiwan. In 2018, it also hosted the first music festival in the world devoted to queer indigenous culture. So, I think there's a lot of potential there as well. I think that would be one trend I'm hoping to see in the future.
I can respond a little bit to your comments because my current project is about transgender justice, more specifically in the rise of neoconservatism in the United States. And one trend or thing I'm interested in is the ways that so many of these conversations get framed as a sort of rhetorical approval or disapproval of transgender people existing in the world. Which I think is not necessarily a very useful way to approach the issue. And here I would turn to the earlier mentions of social and economic rights. I think rather than the approval of existence, it would be access to affordable housing, to safe workspaces, to have the kind of identity documents that reflect who you are that should be at the forefront of the conversation. And as someone who works on literature, I'm less interested in sort of poking holes in the sort of illogic of neoconservative logic, and more interested in imagining what it feels like to be an emergency, or to feel like you're a perpetual emergency, or to live in a state where every day the news is telling you reasons why you should not exist. And so that's something that I'm continuing to think about.
So I've been reflecting that it's an auspicious but also very perplexing moment to celebrate an institutional birthday, because you have to decide what to make the center into next. Some of these centers indeed emerged in the 1970s, like at Columbia and Notre Dame, but many others, like this one, came when human rights were the morality of the end of history in the 1990s. And they have been defined by the realities of the last 25 years, of that moment when there was an open acceptance of unipolarity and an implicit acceptance of neoliberalism. And human rights were about global justice within the terms of those two facts. But they're not facts for long. In the haze of insanity that has marked many of his statements, Vladimir Putin remarked the other day that the Ukraine war is about whether the West accepts that the unipolar reality is passing, and I think he's right about that. And when it comes to neoliberalism, it's under unprecedented challenge. Liz Truss fell from power today because she tried to restore it in its pure Thatcherite form. And it's not by any means dead, but we don't know what the terms of struggle over its succession will be like. And what's the relation of the human rights idea to these changes? Well, I'm not sure that it's going to have a major role, but if it does, a center like this has to be at the forefront of thinking about what it means to practice and theorize human rights in the midst of these changes.
That's awesome. And now a second time to have a last comment. I want to comment this way. I really appreciate what you're saying, and I don't know what those answers are, but I know what I'll do tomorrow. And it's coming back to my one point anyway. Well, today I spoke with a community leader from Englewood who focuses on interpersonal violence, gun violence, by reaching out to people and trying to create relationships, create support for these folks, and untie that public health problem. But we met to talk about maternal and child health because that's another thing that his community is concerned about, and so we're into this process of trying to figure out how we're going to respond to that. And within that, there will be human rights work to be thought through and learned from and practiced. And tomorrow I'm going to North Austin, Hermosa, to talk with a group that's work supporting new migrants, mostly from Central and South America, but is now doing much work around hunger and food. And so we're going to talk about what do they need in terms of health access and ways to be healthy around these questions of food insecurity, including the insecurity of too many bad calories and obesity and diabetes. And so that, to me these aren't answers, but certainly a response, and one that I think needs to be contained within a center for it to be relevant the next 25 years.
All right. Well, you've been very patient for this extraordinarily rich and panel of incredibly diverse perspectives. So we now have some time for questions and discussion from the audience. So if anyone has a question, raise your hand. We also have the possibility of online questions as well. So we'll start with you in the back there. Yeah.
Thank you. My name is Vincent. I'm a first year, and I'm really inspired by this discussion presented by the distinguished speakers. So I realized that the question of climate change has been brought up like several times. So I was wondering, for human rights issues like this, where no specific countries can be really held accountable. Say, for instance, Tuvalu, as we were like speaking, are practically sinking down. Like, it's probably gonna disappear like in a century. So, but we cannot like really hold one country accountable for this. So I was wondering, is there still a possibility that we can still make an effective effort to save countries like this who suffer from human rights issues where no specific countries can be held accountable? Thank you.
So that is a great question, and now we have the question of who would answer. I think, Kamari, you were talking about accountability. Perhaps you could start.
Yes, okay. I'll start. And in fact, thank you for that question. And as you were asking the question, I reflected on my colleague Aisha and as well as others who have, in their scholarship, been interested in the use of particular tools like popular tribunals to hold accountable those who are the most accountable for such vagrant and critical issues. And so in part, I think that this question of accountability needs to go beyond the futility of saying that we can't hold anyone accountable, that in fact, I think we need more innovative ways of demanding accountability. And the People's Tribunal and other modes of popular organization are critical here. We see the same parallels with refugee mobilizations, where countries may not be allowing people to come into their countries. Governments may not allow that, but in fact, everyday people are holding up signs and saying, "You are welcome here." And we're seeing that more and more, and it's the kind of revolutionary fervor that insists that we are the demos, that we must mobilize, and that there is a place even to use those tools, the tool of the tribunal, the tool of legality, the language of the law, to be deployed innovatively in a way that is also paradoxical, but that makes accountable and that uses the public sphere and social media and the other tools that are available to us, a possible terrain for mobilizing counter discourses and counter narratives. And so I think the first place to start is not the futility of holding accountable, but in fact to think creatively and innovatively about ways that we must hold accountable and identify. And I think some of the work that some of my colleagues are doing is really a testament to the tremendous amount of work that's out there and the kind of grassroots mobilizations that is already underway. And so I think Aisha probably might want to speak to that as well, and a few others.
Well, may I?
Yes.
Okay. I'm not sure if we can't hold accountable corporations and certain nation states for climate change. I think there's disproportional responsibility. I traveled yesterday from London, where a campaign like Just Stop Oil, Extinction Rebellion are engaging in spectacular acts of civil disobedience, for example, precisely to raise the question of accountability in one narrative and to literally stop those who are responsible for climate change, including governments with the most amount of carbon emissions and oil and fracking, etc., on their tracks. So I agree with Kamari that there is a lot to be done, but one needs to assume the power to do that rather than waiting for powers that be to take action.
I'd like to get some of the other hands up. Yes, you in the front. Please just wait for the mic. Here you go.
Thank you. I want to ask a question about China. I think China is important in the human rights discussion It's important to me because that's where I grew up, and it's still very dear to my heart. But I think it's also important for a few reasons. One is that 1.4, 1.5 billion people live there under one political entity. 1 out of 5 souls in this earth live in China. So from a utilitarian perspective, whatever happens there is going to have a huge impact. And two, I think things are really bad. China has never been a liberal democracy, but I think what's new in the past couple of years is that, the government has become more authoritarian. But also, what makes me feel quite hopeless is the state seems to have almost a totalitarian grasp on the society. And I'll give an example.
Can I ask you to ask a question, though?
Yeah, I'm sorry.
Time is short.
Okay, I'm sorry. So a few days ago, some person hung a banner on a bridge in Beijing protesting Xi Jinping's third term, and within a few hours on the internet, songs with names "Bridge" or "Brave Men" are taken down. This is the extent that you have a censorship army of millions to control the society. There seems to be no possibility of communicating dissent or having a discussion. And third, I think, unlike many other countries, a lot of the traditional ways to implement human rights work or influence governments doesn't seem to work with China, right? China is not dependent on Western aid, or is not dependent on the United States for economic or military purposes. So what can be done there? It seems like an impregnable fortress that allows no hope for change for the better.
Thank you. So the China question, massive question. Does anyone want to take it on?
Darren.
I could start with a response.
Perfect.
I mean, it's a really important question, and just to speak to the previous one as well, one of the reasons why Uyghurs ended up in camps was because the land they live on is a source of 20% of China's oil and natural gas, and so much now cotton, which is part of the global economy. It's part of what fueled an export-oriented economy in China. And so, our desire for cheap commodities is in some ways part of what has produced this colonial situation in Northwest China. And so I think, sharing complicity and thinking about sort of the distributed blame that we should associate with human rights violations is really important. And I think a critique of the global economy is part of that. Climate change and pollution in China is part of that manufacturing, the industrial driver of the economy. So, pollution in China is also partly our responsibility. But to speak to your question about how do we even think about China and respond in terms of like what's going on the ground there, it's really hard. I mean, it is becoming a techno-authoritarian state that's using really cutting-edge forms of surveillance to control the population, their access to information. In Eastern China, people can still use VPNs for the most part to access news outside of China, but that's still quite limited to a certain group. So there's not easy answers, and I think we have to sort of sit with that there isn't easy answers to this, and be really aware of it, and think with as much complexity as we can about partial strategies. And one of the things I'm seeing from youth, people perhaps like you, is a strategy of POW, of running. Like that's a kind of new discourse that's emerging in Chinese social media of like how people are trying to get out. And I think diaspora movement and thinking from the margins is one strategy of thinking about a better future for China. It will not always be this way, and hopefully we can move towards something that's less terrifying, really.
Kaushik, you had a question? Yeah, but wait for the mic if you could.
Thank you. I really appreciate everything that the panelists have said. I want to think through a little bit the relationship between the institutional and the popular that's on the table here. I very much appreciate the importance of upending top-down power structures with more bottom-up and grassroots critiques and forms. But I also, when the top-down has come up in the panel, it has invariably been associated with strong states, America, Europe, Russia, China. And I wanted to hear a little bit more about, I don't want to romanticize at all the global south. I know that some of the most virulent authoritarianisms are coming from there. But I wanted to hear a little bit more about what the panel thinks, not just about post-colonial critiques of human rights, but also post-colonial forms of human rights, which often, where the division between the state and the popular often refracts differently. We're less than 4 months from the release of the Colombian Truth Commission report, for instance, which is hardly a state project, but it's not simply a popular project as well. It's an institutional project, and it makes trenchant critiques of American imperialism. So I'm wondering what the panel thinks about the present and the future of sort of what one might call post-colonial or global southern forms of human rights discourse and critique and practice.
I'll get started. I think there are probably many on this panel who have thoughts on this question. But I study the Middle East, and some have described the Arab uprisings and the other uprisings in the region, from the Green Movement in Iran to the Gezi protests in Turkey, as the first truly human rights revolution that the world has seen. But the idiom of human rights was totally alien to the ones that we are accustomed to in the global north, or that we teach about typically in international human rights law programs. There was very little, although it was interpreted as a demand for democracy, actually that was very much not the primary tenor of the demands of the uprisings. And actually it was a recalibration of what's important and what are people's lived experience of deprivation. And so bread was put co-equally with dignity as a set of demands, and dignity had as much to do with social rights as it had to do anything with civil and political rights. And so I think we've seen, first of all, that you have grassroots movements, also these popular movements for mechanisms of accountability, critiques of forms of power that are articulating and identify with a project of human rights, but interpolate it in ways that are very distinctive and very much indigenized, in ways that I think we need to pay attention to, and requires us to shift our focus to the non-Western context, non-Western political histories as the source of analytic focus for thinking through and re-theorizing what we mean in a world in which we are in a post-unipolar and perhaps at least a non-neoliberal, not exclusively neoliberal context. And I think this connects to the first question on climate change. If we abandon the thinking of accountability around individualized conceptions that asks, can we pin this on one country? Can we think about one wrongdoer that we hold to account? And instead ask broad structural questions about how we've come here globally. How have we come to this position? For example, how is it that decolonization proceeded with absolutely no conceptualization of reparation? And what does a call for reparative justice today mean? If we can't name a particular actor, we can certainly name trends and structural features of the international system that are legacies of an earlier, deeply unequal system, and that produce structural inequalities today that we can actually articulate very clearly. And we can think about what kinds of calls for accountability emanate from understanding the state of the world and the international order from the global south, or from below, or from the experience of those that have been marginalized by the very processes that produce the kinds of forms of global wealth that today immiserate populations. And so this connects very much to almost all of the themes that were raised by other panelists. But I think that's what it would look like to rethink the question from, if below, if you want, in the sense of the South, but also bottom up, rather than from the kinds of conventional frames that we inherited from the 1940s, 1970s, 1990s, and think from a different perspective today.
I see we have a question online.
Thank you. This is a question from Hannah Ridge, and Hannah asks, I'd like to consider the potential tension in some social economic rights. We see increasing discussion of rights to food, housing, healthcare, and education. However, these things only occur because of labor, something professors are intimately familiar with in education. Can we square a right to the products of labor with a right to bodily autonomy on the part of those who labor in those domains?
Who's best for this? Sam, is that your domain?
I don't think so, but
you can pass.
they can answer anyway. Well, I think Hannah sounds right to me. If I understood the question, it would be wrong just to think in, let's say, welfarist terms about various rights without taking on the justice and injustice of labor and production and service, especially in a changing economy. And so I think this is something that, many people already on the panel have argued that the mainstream human rights movement has neglected, although there are a lot of resources in the past, notably when it comes to the right to form unions and to strike, which have been fought for tooth and nail in various locales. I totally agree that we shouldn't think that all grassroots movements are good or everything from the global south is good, but there are a lot of useful ways of reorienting human rights to focus on labor, since, of course, at the present time, the global south does so much labor for consumers in the global north. So this, I think, is, there have been years in which a lot of human rights activists in all parts have done extraordinary work in focusing on labor and production more generally. And I think there's just more of that that needs to happen. And Hannah is completely right about that.
I think what I'd like to do is take 3 questions from the students, and then we'll turn it back to the panel before we close. So how about you in front? Just wait for the mic, and then you'll be next. You're number 2, and you at the end will be number 3.
Hi. Hello. Thank you for all being here. This has been such an edifying discussion. I don't know if this is on. I think it's on
yes,
now.
Now it's working.
I think that the discussion that was had around storytelling was really compelling to me. But my question now is, how do we effectively combat somewhat pernicious narratives effectively, especially in an age in which polarization is so prevalent? I'm thinking about the critical race theory, education debate. I'm thinking about, like you had mentioned, Suketu, about Putin and the myth of Russia and Ukraine. So yeah, how do we do that when there's so many ties that are leading people to one side or the other?
Super. And you? Yeah.
It's on?
Yeah.
Okay, so this is working. I think we've talked about post-colonial critique, and it's been interesting to me because we want to turn to the people who are most affected by human rights and some of the adverse consequences of the world being organized as it is, with most global South countries honestly under the thumb of much of the global North. I want to take seriously what people have been saying on the ground. It's not even just human rights violations that most people talk about and human rights that they reach out to. But I'm hoping we could put on the table, seeing as how we can talk about Thatcherism or neoliberalism, but there's a serious contestation over the existence of capitalism, and people on the ground in the global South are mentioning socialism, anarchism, communism, Marxist-Leninism. I want to take seriously, perhaps, Pablo Gilbert's idea of coextensive, coterminous, maximal justice. Because I'm at a particular moment here as one of the 14 human rights majors that is a bit queasy about human rights because of some of those limitations related to political economy. And I want to hear some thoughts from the folks up there. If I know it's probably going to be Professor Moyne again. I want to hear more about how we can go beyond human rights but still be grounded in it. Maybe there's a problem with maximal justice in the first place when we're not looking so hot right now, but I'd love to hear more about that.
Wonderful. And then the last question here.
Thank you so much for being here and speaking to us. So many of my peers and I who want to do good in the world are grappling with the tension of being part of institutions that have been at times ineffective at stopping human rights abuses and at worst complicit or perpetuating them. So can you speak at all to why you do what you do, where you do, and what you see as the future of the place of academia in the human rights space?
What a great question. We have the whole panel. So, Ketu, do you want to start with the story?
Sure thing. Thank you for your question. I think it's the future of the planet rests on storytelling. And the question of how do we deal with this this concept of storytelling? So something wonderful is happening today, which is that people are telling their own stories. People who didn't tell their stories before. So you mentioned critical race theory. Well, the people who were most affected by race are now telling their own stories. Not just personal stories, but also stories about American history. Mm-hmm. And so it's who has permission to narrate, who gets the prizes, who gets published, who are the gatekeepers. And just, I think in the last decade or so, in publishing, in journalism, of course we have a long, long way to go, but there are these voices coming out who are telling their own stories. So, in migration, the people that you deal with, the refugees or asylum seekers or economic refugees, who are coming across the borders. So often etymology is destiny. Whether you are branded as an asylum seeker or an economic refugee or a migrant or a traveler or a tourist determines whether or not you'll be let across this border. So you have to have a kind of personal story. And that story has to be complex, and it's got to be true. So these people who are coming across these borders, they have a certain story that has been thrust upon them, that they are criminals, rapists, they're coming here to take. The true story that they should be telling themselves, and some of them are, is that they are coming here because we stole their future, and now we have become their future. And this ties back to the earlier question about accountability for climate change. By the middle of this century, around 1 billion people will have been displaced by climate change. And I think the story that needs to be told, and most of all by themselves, is that they have a right, a moral right, a human right, to move to the countries that caused their predicament.
Capitalism and human rights. I guess we have to start with Sam, since you've written at least one book on that, maybe 2 or 3.
I can defer to others who have, I don't have good answers. My own view is that we shouldn't work with the concept of capitalism, but if we want to talk about unjust market relations, it's just true that human rights don't provide a theory of structural domination in and through markets. That's not what human rights were meant to do. And then we should put them in their place for the good they can do in identifying and possibly remediating some forms of wrong, but not others. And then we look to the global south or anyone for other theories and other movements, including ones that can think seriously about structural disempowerment.
Juno, I wonder if I could turn to you with the last question. Just to start out, I think everyone might have a view on that, but why do you do what you do, and what is the role of academia in this project?
Well, the role of academia, I also work at an institution that has perpetuated human rights violations, that has a history of slave owning, and I see my work there as inevitably kind of vexed. I don't expect the institution to be the source of freedom or even inspiration, but I do see programs that are sort of para-institutional, like we have a prison university program right now. Our graduate students are unionizing, which is really exciting, as one way to sort of organize, if not against the institution, maybe somewhat athwart what its ideals might be. And I'm really inspired by the kinds of organizing that happen in New Haven, where I live, that are extra institutional, that have nothing to do with the university. And so I think that looking to the university as as a solution. I shouldn't say this maybe at the Pozen Center Human Rights celebration, but that's where I tend to go, and I really appreciate the university for giving me that ability.
We have about 30 seconds. So Asla, do you want to take one of those questions? Or?
Sure, I'll connect the last two questions just to say that human rights is a powerful discursive frame that lots of people and communities use for very different purposes. And as academics, actually, we can influence the direction that frame takes. So one thought is, well, human rights doesn't have an account of this or that thing. But actually, human rights is an extraordinarily elastic frame that can be moved in different directions. And one of our roles is to propose what those directions might look like and to offer a much more structural theory as an example of how markets do disempower, or a structural theory of discrimination. And oftentimes, this international framework actually offers more than the domestic analog frameworks might do. So it has, as an example, a structural account of racial and gender discrimination that is absent from the domestic American frame of equal protection. And so it may actually be a useful vehicle for advancing, let's say, in a city council or in a municipal context, even where the United States hasn't ratified a treaty. To give an example from a city I long lived in Los Angeles, we persuaded the Los Angeles City Council to adopt CEDAW and CERD, where the United States hadn't adopted CEDAW, wasn't implementing CERD, and use them to transform local county jails and conditions, holding municipal actors accountable. Now, are those instruments fantastic instruments? Do they need to be redrafted or rethought? Sure, but who's going to do that work? And there are lots of answers to that question, but interestingly, scholars can play a really critical role because they act as sort of critics of the existing normative framework and propose different ways to move forward, including in roles as independent experts. And so it's this kind of dirty secret that you may have very little actual grounded experience, and yet you can do a great deal to alter or shift the framework by weighing in as a so-called independent expert in various kinds of international fora. It's one system of many that we have, one toolkit of many that are available. But you have to ask yourself, if I'm trying to achieve a particular kind of change, which of these toolkits is best suited to getting from A to B for the purposes I'm interested in? And what can I do in terms of the resources I bring to the equation? And if this happens to be the one that can be useful, I think you can think much more broadly than what does the doctrine do today, and ask what you can get the doctrine to do tomorrow.
There are many more questions. Fortunately, we are going to have some time to talk to the entire panel, and I'll turn it over to Mark to close us out.
Thank you, Tom. I wonder if you would all join us in a big round of applause for to me, the possibility of looking forward and thinking where we'll go over the next 25 years is, in fact, the most important part of what this celebration is about. And so the kinds of issues that all of you were raising tonight, there's a lot for us to think with as we begin to think about those strategies and how we want to formulate them as faculty and as students over the next several years. There will be more opportunity to talk to everybody who's up on the stage. We have a lovely reception that's all set up just outside this room, and everyone will be there for that. Also, many of the people on the stage are going to be doing smaller seminars and workshops with programs and departments tomorrow. Those are all in your programs, and so if you're interested in doing a kind of deeper dive with one or more of the people up on the stage, I really encourage you to do that tomorrow. We wanted to have a combination of a lot of people together talking and then some really intensive conversations tomorrow, and so we see this as a kind of two-day thing. I just want to offer one more thanks, and that is, you know, it's not easy to put on a 25th anniversary. It turns out iHouse is doing their 90th. That's probably harder, but 25 is hard enough. We have a fabulous staff at the Pozen Center who have meticulously put together what has been a tremendous event tonight and a whole larger set of things that are going on over the next couple of days. Adam and Cliff and Sarah in particular, what you've done has been absolutely amazing. We've had student volunteers, as you've seen tonight, helping out in all kinds of ways. Again, a big round of applause in thanking you guys. And thanks for coming, and please join us for the reception so we can keep the conversation going.